because the people who have the most to gain from organizing
Right.
Are the most vulnerable. So there's enforcement in all of these policies that keeps the people who are most affected from organizing. Let's remember, people have been focused on partisan politics instead of anti-war, anti-torture organizing, right? I mean,
Right.
the realm of partisan politics, electoral politics, has really sucked up a lot of the political oxygen. So it isn't that people aren't organizing, they are organizing, but they're organizing around elections. Right? They're pouring their faith into the Democratic Party.
Right.
And people are tremendously disillusioned. It's really, history moves when groups organize to advance and protect their interests. This 35-year phase of history that I'm talking about, I think is best understood as a counter-revolution against Keynesianism,
Okay.
or what's sometimes referred to as a revolt of the elites,
Okay.
which is to say that the previous big shock that opened up the previous phase of history was the Great Depression. That before the Great Depression, you had a period of pretty unfettered capitalism. And the crash of 1929 was this wake-up call where the world saw this very ugly and experienced, didn't just see, capitalism at its worst, deregulated capitalism at its worst. People
Right.
jumping out of windows, Dust Bowl refugees, and there was this consensus that the market couldn't be left to regulate itself because it was just too volatile, and that there needed to be, that politicians, policymakers needed to get involved to temper the market, to regulate the market, to soften its edges, and also to have a safety net to catch people when they fell,
Okay,
right?
yeah.
And so that was the beginning of the Keynesian era.
The New Deal and
Exactly,
Yeah.
which had a lot of, obviously a lot of government intervention, and the idea that it was the role of government to create jobs through public works projects, that large unions were needed as a counterpoint to the power of corporations, and this continued through the post-war era. And what fueled it in the post-war era was, first of all, understanding how how economic hardship had provided such fertile ground for fascism in Germany, for the rise of Nazism in Germany,
Right.
but also that the war effort had been this tremendous public works project and this era of big government, and that the Allies had sacrificed so much in that war that people came home and said, okay, if we could do this, if we could fight this war and build this arsenal, then we should also have a healthcare system. We should also have, we should also be getting good things from our government. So this was the era of big government, and it was also kind of a golden age for economic growth. But it was, and here we're talking about the 30s through the 60s, it was a period of redistribution of wealth, the rise of the middle class.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, the reason why I say the era that we're in now is the revolt of the elites is that the problem with this era, or this previous era, is that it really did cut into their profits. Having to pay their workers, or who represented by large unions, higher and higher wages, and having to pay higher taxes to subsidize those social programs was getting a little bit tiresome. So the era that we've been living in has been a revolt against the New Deal, against these policies, and basically saying, we want it back.
Right.
And it has been, on the one hand, what are the core tenets of this ideological campaign? Attacks on unions, casualization of labor, demands for lower taxes, and also a feeding off of the state that was built up in this period. So you had all of this investment in public infrastructure and some very lucrative assets in the public sphere. Transportation system, roadways, and water systems, electricity systems, and really what we've been living in, in what's sometimes called the neoliberal era, it has been about transferring that public wealth into private hands. Did Pinochet and Thatcher and Reagan understand that they were part of a revolution against the New Deal? Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely, and they were warriors in this process.
Okay.
mean, I think that neoliberal, that these economic policies, unfettered capitalism, can coexist with a society that has elections.
Okay.
But I don't think that it can coexist with a society where politicians actually make good on their election promises, particularly when it comes to the economy.
And what are the conditions? When the International Monetary Fund goes in with a bailout for a country, they come with a list of conditions. It's called structural adjustment, okay? So I think we should start thinking like a People's International Monetary Fund and think about what's our structural adjustment that we want to impose on the financial industry. So they're continuing with this outrageous subsidy that every serious economist in the world has said makes absolutely no sense. All it is a continuation of what we've seen from this administration consistently, which is crony capitalism, okay? Where they spend 7 years, the first 7 years of this administration, transferring public money into private hands through the form of these no-bid contracts and building this parallel government, the Blackwater-Halliburton economy. There's nothing free market about it. It's about who you know, it's about the lobbyists you've paid. And it's just paying contractors to do the job of government at a profit, okay? That is the true legacy of this administration. And now, as their final gift, they are privatizing, they are nationalizing the bad debts of the corporate sector, taking those private debts and making them public debts, okay? They haven't abandoned that part of the plan. But, talking about dog years, the reason why I think it's worth focusing on this is because the public has already had an impact on this discussion. And the fact that we're even able to change course and go to this equity model as opposed to this toxic debt model, just taking on the debts, is because there was an incredible uprising in this country. Nobody organized it. It was spontaneous. It was grassroots. And that happened after the original bailout was announced. Both political parties lined up against it. Both major candidates for president endorsed it. But the people said no, even though CNN was selling it harder than they had sold anything since the Iraq War, saying this is not a bailout for Wall Street, it's a bailout for Main Street. We really have to get behind this. People called their congresspeople. 99% of the calls said, don't bail them out. This is a bad deal, right? And it was a shocker. It was a shocker. But Congress voted originally against that bailout. They voted against it, and the New York Times broke it down, and they found out that the Congress people who voted against the bailout were overwhelmingly in very tight races, i.e. they were fighting for their jobs, i.e. they found themselves uncharacteristically interested in the opinions of their constituents, right?
Only a crisis, real or perceived, produces real change. And he was admitting that his ideas, his vision of a radical privatized world couldn't be imposed in the absence of a crisis. He was referring to economic crises, and economic crises have played that role of sort of softening the ground for the imposition of shock therapy. The Asian economic crisis was a classic example. The so-called tequila crisis in Mexico was another one that unleashed a wave of privatizations in Mexico. But as people become more resistant and more aware of these strategies, and you see these mass mobilizations against the institutions that exploited shock, like the International Monetary Fund, then what starts to happen is the shocks need to get bigger in order for the disorientation to be greater. And that's where you have what I call disaster capitalism. What the Bush administration did after September 11th, when the war on terror was declared, is they essentially launched a new economy. Because the parameters of this economy were extraordinarily wide. This is an endless war, we were told. That the enemy could not be reasoned with, there could be no diplomacy, there could be no discussion, there could only be attack, and that it would not end until evil was defeated everywhere, right? So if you think of it as a business plan, it could hardly be more profitable, because basically what you're saying is you've got this new market, it's never going to end, and we have unlimited funds to finance this new market. So unlike a one-off war, what they were building was a permanent new part of the economy, a privatized security state. The metaphor of shock therapy, so I started reading about its use in psychiatric contexts and also its use in torture. And that led me to a really close reading of the declassified CIA interrogation manuals that were first published in 1963 and in the 80s, reprinted and have since been declassified. And looking at how the CIA talks about the importance of putting prisoners into a state of shock, because when they're in a state of shock, they're not able to protect their interests. They become childlike and regressed. The interrogation manuals are really obsessed with this idea of regression. So I started to think about how that had been applied on a mass scale. The exploitation of crisis and shock has very consciously been used by radical free marketeers and
corporations. And we know that it's not that they're against regulation. Right? They're against regulation that stands in the way of their ability to accumulate profit, and they are for regulation that protects those profits, like intellectual property protections on life-saving drugs and on seeds. And that's what free trade agreements are for, and that's what the World Trade Organization is for. We have an opportunity because that whole financial architecture is in crisis right now. The World Trade Organization hasn't been able to get its talks back on track. The International Monetary Fund is discredited, but suddenly we're seeing governments cooperating internationally to save the banks. So why can't they cooperate internationally to close the tax havens, to impose a Tobin tax on currency speculation? Why can't we be demanding of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank that in this moment the Washington Consensus is dead? There will be no structural adjustment conditions attached to any loans that are given to countries during this financial crisis. I mean, who is pushing for the privatization of essential services like water, bridges, roads? It's these same banks. They're the ones who have been pushing for it. They call it the next bubble, the infrastructure bubble. We've never had a better time to say to the public, do you really think it's a good idea to put more things that are too important to fail in the hands of this reckless casino? We have our arguments made for us, okay, by reality.